So we're out, but our future relationship with the EU has yet to be determined, and other issues, from the terrorist threat to the future of the BBC, are moving up the government's agenda. After almost 50 years of EU membership,
we are no longer a member of the European Union.
He said, we beat the establishment.
Brexit.
You got through a half-an-hour speech without mentioning the Brexit word. Is it banned?
It's not banned, it's just over.
Now comes the hard bit. And both sides are pretty far apart.
A long, long period of hard bargaining.
He wants an agreement like Canada's.
There is no need for a free trade agreement to involve accepting EU rules.
We must now agree to ensure a level playing field over the long term.
A trading relationship corresponding to Australia's with the EU. That is a new euphemism for no deal, isn't it? Because there is no trade agreement you can point to.
From the Metropolitan Police.
Also this week,
a man has been shot by armed officers. The incident is terrorist related.
The government promises emergency legislation.
Ending the early release. We need legislation to do that.
You have a potential legal challenge, potentially human rights challenges that could be brought.
What we actually need are long-term solutions to difficult problems.
He was being followed by 20 police officers. That is a problem that needs to be dealt with immediately.
But the official who was planning it, Claire O'Neill,
the former Tory minister charged with organising this year's UN summit on climate, was sacked by Boris Johnson.
He said he doesn't understand climate change.
Well, he doesn't really get it.
Jeremy Corbyn pounced on her remarks at Prime Minister's questions.
So why is the Prime Minister failing so spectacularly to measure up to the scale of the climate crisis?
Mr. Speaker, this is beyond satire. The
government also has plans for the BBC.
We will undertake a detailed look at the future of the TV licence model.
Tonight, I'll be speaking to former Conservative Culture Secretary John Whittingdale, French MEP Nathalie Loiseau, and the independent reviewer of our anti-terror laws, Jonathan Hall. Evening all, we're live from Westminster, where, after the mayhem of last year, a preternatural serenity pervades. So, to liven things up, the government has decided to wage war with the media. Well, with Brexit sorted, it's got time on its hands. Hostilities began when this man, he's the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the worst-dressed apparatchik in Whitehall, Dominic Cummings is his name, insisted that the self-styled elite of Her Majesty's Loyal Press Corps, known as the Westminster Lobby, henceforth had to cross the road from Parliament to Downing Street to get their off-the-record briefings. You can understand their outrage. I mean, walking several hundred yards every day is quite an ordeal to be spoon-fed stories and spin. This week, that tether snapped, and who can blame them? They staged a mass walkout when Downing Street decided that only specialist journalists would be welcome to attend a Brexit briefing. By specialist, it meant largely not from left-wing publications. Of course, here at the BBC, we're used to the rough side of Mr. Cummings' tongue. He's already limited ministerial appearances to Peppa Pig and is now out to deprive us of as much licence fee income as he can. So we welcome our new brothers and sisters of the lobby in the struggle for truth, justice and unlimited expenses. And we have this to say to them when they've recovered from the rigours of that 50-yard walkout to the Red Line. Boris Johnson isn't the first Prime Minister to wage war on the media. So did this one, and this one, oh, and this one too. And guess what? They've all gone, and we're still here. Earlier I spoke to the former Culture Secretary, Conservative MP, John Whittingdale. John Whittingdale, the government's considering changing the rules to decriminalise non-payment of the licence fee. Could cost the BBC maybe up to about 200 million in lost revenue. Should the government compensate the BBC for that revenue?
Well, I don't think it's been proven that that would be the case. I mean, obviously, even if it is decriminalised, it will still be a requirement for people to pay the licence fee. It would just put it on the same basis as most other household charges, like the council tax or like utilities.
But there'll be some loss of revenue if it's decriminalised. Should the government compensate?
I don't think that there is any case for that, because if the people do evade, then they will still be in breach of their
But for
requirements.
any other industry, if you change the rules and the rules resulted in a loss, you would be on the line for compensation.
Well, I don't think it is accepted necessarily that it would lead to a massive increase in evasion, but that is one of the things which we need to look at. This is a consultation. It isn't a decision that was taken.
I understand. I just said
and it was something which I looked at when I was Secretary of State.
I'll come to that. But how is it fair on the vast majority of viewers who pay the licence fee to make it easier for people to avoid paying it?
Well, I don't think it necessarily makes it easier. What it does is put it on the same basis as most other taxes, charges that people have to pay. And I think there is a case that to impose a criminal conviction on people who simply struggle to afford it is unfair, and certainly that is something which has been widely felt. And of course the whole landscape of broadcasting is changing very rapidly, and we said at the time this is something which should be kept under review, and that is exactly what is happening.
Well, you mentioned 4 years ago the government commissioned an independent review into this very matter. That independent review concluded that the current system is fair, it's proportionate, it's the best value for money, because any change would result in more evasion. That was the report's conclusion. You were Culture Secretary. You accepted that verdict.
Well,
What's changed in 4 years?
It was part of the discussions we were having with the BBC about a whole variety of issues. The BBC was very much opposed. There were other areas in which we wanted the BBC to accept change.
But hold on, there was a specific review on decriminalising. That review concluded that the existing system was the fairest way to continue. You accepted that as Culture Secretary.
At the time.
What changed?
Well, one of the things that has changed is that the whole broadcasting landscape looks different, even though it's only 4 years.
Yeah.
At the time that that report was commissioned, there was very little choice outside the main broadcasters. We've seen a massive growth in terms of people like Netflix and Amazon and Apple all coming on board, and people are now choosing to subscribe.
But that's an argument. That's a case for having an overall look at the licence fee.
Which indeed...
for the whole purpose of a licence fee is viability in this new age we're in. Though, by the way, 4 years ago, I still had 1,000 channels to choose from in my TV set. I don't know how you were so restricted. But that's a different matter.
Most of those were not subscription channels. Sky was.
Well, most of them were, actually. You had to subscribe to Sky to get them.
The big ones.
But the whole question of the future of the licence fee, which I understand comes onto the agenda with the streaming service. I know that. That's not what this was about. This was about decriminalising. And I'd ask you again, what changed? You accepted it 4 years ago, now you don't.
Well, firstly, we said that we wanted to keep it under review, and that is exactly what is happening. It may be that the same conclusions are reached, but I think it is worth looking at, particularly because there clearly is a lot of dissatisfaction. All the opinion polls show that people are unhappy about the present arrangement, and therefore, whilst I think there is no prospect of getting rid of the licence fee in the immediate future, there should be a debate about its long-term future. It is a question which we can address now as to whether it's still appropriate, but it should be a criminal offence, unlike any of the other charges that households have to bear.
I'll tell you what's changed. The change is that this government is out for revenge on the BBC. That's the real reason, isn't it? It didn't like the BBC's coverage of the general election. It didn't like its coverage of Brexit. So it's out to kind of shortchange the BBC wherever it can. It's an act of revenge.
Well, I would be extremely unhappy if that were the case, and I don't believe that it is.
Well,
I think
you heard what Boris Johnson said on Brexit night last Friday, didn't you, in Downing Street?
I have listened to the Prime Minister, yes, of course.
He says the people of this country voted to leave despite everything they were told by the CBI and the BBC. He's calling the BBC, in effect, a political opponent. He's out to get it.
There are serious concerns, I think, about the way the BBC have covered some of the recent political debate, particularly the Brexit debate, and I think the government is quite entitled to express those
concerns. So it
concerns.
is an act of revenge.
But that is not the reason why we are considering whether or not to decriminalise. The two have to be kept separate. I mean, I was responsible for the charter which now governs the BBC, and the independence of the BBC is absolutely central to that, and I support that.
But under this government, the licence fee has been cut by 20% in real terms. You put onto the BBC's account paying for the cost of free licences for the over 75s. You now proposing a system that could cost the BBC another 200 million a year. It just seems to me that you're doing everything you can to leave the BBC struggling with a diminished income, that it's a political revenge for that.
The licence fee settlement that I reached with the BBC actually unfroze the licence fee. Since that time it has been rising each year in line with inflation, and also we made a couple of other changes. We closed the so-called iPlayer loophole, which the BBC felt very strongly was
down
leading to a loss
20% in
of
real
revenue.
terms.
Well, there was a period when it was frozen.
Well, let me show you what you get for this money. Although it's down 20% in real terms, there you can see these are mainly the things that the BBC does. If you squeeze it any more, what should be cut?
Well, that's a matter for the BBC. And
but you're doing the squeezing.
The BBC,
what would you cut?
The BBC made an announcement recently about where they were going to find cost savings.
But would you cut any of these services?
Well, that is not for me to say to the BBC.
Well, but
excuse
me. Every time the BBC suggests that because of this squeeze on its revenues, that it needs to look at closing some services, backbenchers, your colleagues are up in arms about doing it. On the one hand, you squeeze it tight, 20% cut in real terms. The moment it tries to cut its cloth, you can't do that. You mustn't close that. So what you think does matter?
Well, the BBC have been very crafty in the past of choosing services which are very popular and saying, oh, this may not be able to continue, and then lots of people have protested.
So you tell us what should be cut.
It is a matter for the BBC. I'm not going to say the BBC shouldn't broadcast the children's service or the...
So if the BBC has chosen popular stuff to cut for political reasons in a way, to make it difficult, that's really what you're saying. Tell us the unpopular stuff that should be cut.
Well, as I say, I'm not going to start telling the BBC. What I do believe, however, and this is part of the longer-term debate which needs to happen, is that the BBC offered all these services and continue to at a time when there was much less choice. You now have an extraordinary plethora, particularly of drama and entertainment. Now, whether or not the BBC needs to go on doing all of those things on as many channels is a long-term question for the BBC.
Our time has run out. John Whittingdale, thank you. Now, Boris Johnson made a speech on Monday laying out the government's vision for a future relationship with the EU based on a free trade agreement like the one the EU already has with Canada. Earlier, I spoke to the French MEP and former Europe Minister, Nathalie Loiseau. She's on the UK contact group of MEPs who have been consulted on the negotiations. Nathalie Loiseau, Boris Johnson wants a Canada-style free trade agreement with the EU. Is the EU prepared to negotiate on that basis?
Well, we just had the first meeting of the UK coordination group in the European Parliament discussing with Michel Barnier. There is a will for an ambitious partnership with the United Kingdom. There was a strong sense of unity among the members of the European Parliament to propose an ambitious partnership and at the same time which has to be free and fair, which means that the single market will be open if and only if there is no dumping from the British side.
So if the EU is prepared to go down the Canada route, and I'm not clear from your answer that it is, but if it is, why is the EU insisting that the UK has to follow existing and future Brussels rules? I mean, that's not in the Canada Free Trade Agreement, it's not in the one you have with Japan or the one you have with South Korea.
If I remember correctly, the UK is not Canada, it's not Japan, and it's not Korea. It's been a member state, it's very close to the European Union, and our interests are really linked. So it's up to the British government to decide. If the notion is only Canada, it means that it's not zero tariffs, zero quota.
Well, it's pretty much zero
tariffs. Canada.
It's pretty much zero tariffs. 98% of goods traded between Canada and the EU have no tariffs.
And parts of services are not included in CETA. Well, it's really up to the UK to decide what sort of relationship they want with the European Union. But it will come with consequences on the openness of our market. It will really be a balance between rights and obligations. And we are deeply convinced that the most profitable relationship would be that we follow the same path in terms of protection of the environment or protection of workers. It's a political choice that you will be making.
But it seems
if
that
you
Mr.
want to diverge, you are sovereign, that's your right.
It seems
but
that
it will
Mr.
not
Johnson,
be the same relation with the European Union.
It seems that Mr. Johnson has made his choice. He wants a comprehensive Canadian-style free trade agreement, and if that means that there has to be some alignment, he'd rather have it less comprehensive. That's the British position now.
Well, if it is clear, we will adjust. But let us not compare Canada, which signed an agreement with the European Union in order to converge with the European Union, and the United Kingdom, which is willing to negotiate in order to diverge. This is very different, and it means that our position will be very simply to protect our citizens, to protect our businesses, and to protect the consistency of the single market. And believe me, it is the interest of the UK to have a well-functioning single market, because this is the destination of most of your exports.
Well, not most of our exports, it's about 45%. The EU is also insisting that any agreement has to be subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Can you point to any other EU free trade deal where that's a condition?
There is a good reason for which we need the Court of Justice. It's because you are still abiding by the European law. You are in the transition period.
No, but this will be after the transition period.
There will be a need to interpret the...
This will be afterwards. What the EU is saying is that if we do a free trade deal, if there's any disagreement subsequently about how either side's behaving, it's the European Court of Justice that does the arbitration. Give me another free trade deal you've done with anybody, which includes the ECJ.
If it is about interpreting the European law, there is not another body that is entitled to interpret the European law than the European Court of Justice.
But the ECJ does not play a role in the EU-Canadian free trade deal.
Because Canada never abided by the European law. That's a huge difference. You're not Canada, once again.
It would seem that you're not really willing to go down the Canada road. You want the ECJ to have a role. You want us to continue to remain aligned with Brussels rules, even though we would have no say over them. That's really what you want, isn't it?
We want to have the best possible relationship. And for your businesses to be able to work with the single market in the best profitable way for them is to have the same rules, the same norms. Otherwise, there are going to be more and more controls, more and more barriers, and I'm not sure it's good for your businesses.
Well, Brussels
and it's not good for the single market.
But we won't be in the single market anymore. We will have a free trade relationship. So I don't quite understand where the level playing field comes in here. But if we're going to have one, for the sake of a free trade agreement, would the EU be prepared to level up to UK standards?
What is interesting in our conversation is that we never had this conversation before your election. I would like to know whether British voters were well informed that the will of this government was to diverge on environment, on state aids, or on labour laws from the European Union. We have to have coherence between us.
Well, let's look at some coherence. The UK enjoys 39 weeks of paid maternity leave. France, you only get 16. France spends twice as much on state aid to businesses.
And that's the only example that you keep on repeating.
France,
I was not aware that
France spends twice as much on state aid as the United Kingdom.
I was not aware that I was talking to the spokesperson.
So would you level up to our standards on these matters?
Spokesperson of Boris Johnson. I wonder if the UK is so much willing to be ambitious in terms of labour law and on environment, why a coherence with the European Union should be a problem. But don't imagine that Brexit comes with no consequence. Don't ask for the benefits of Norway with the constraints of Canada. It will not work.
But the British government, rightly or wrongly, the British government isn't asking for the benefits of Norway, because Norway is in the single market, and the British government has made it clear it doesn't want to be in the single market. It's also made it clear it doesn't want to continue with alignment
yes, but access
of
to
EU
the
rules.
market.
Let me finish the question. It's also certain it won't agree to the jurisdiction of the ECJ. When you look at all that and you look at the EU position, is a no deal becoming more likely?
Well, I listened carefully to your Prime Minister saying that it will be a Canada deal or an Australian deal. It was a strange way of mentioning that he was rushing to a no deal.
But in your view, is a no deal becoming more likely?
But this could be your choice. I always thought that it was a possibility, and the European Union always prepared itself for this scenario, which would be bad for the EU and terrible for the UK.
I mean, it's generally agreed that no deal would not be good for Britain. I understand that. But the Eurozone is stagnating. France is rocked by strikes and unrest. Germany is in industrial recession. Italy is in an economic recession. Are you sure that the EU could afford no deal?
I'm surprised that a journalist doesn't know that there are no strikes anymore in France, but that's not a problem. We are going to pass important reforms, and we have one of the highest growth rates of the Eurozone.
You had 2 months of strikes, and you've had a year of the Gilets jaunes.
Yes, and we survived it, even with the strong growth rates, which means that we are very strong in terms of economic terms. But you're very right. I'm not sure we can afford to play this game of hurting each other. I do believe that a strong partnership is preferable to any sort of no deal, and we stand ready for an ambitious offer, and for this, it takes two to tango.
Nathalie Loiseau, thank you for joining us on that. I hope we can get a chance to talk again as these negotiations get underway.
My pleasure.
There was another shocking terrorist incident on Sunday when a man armed with a knife stabbed passer-by in Streatham High Street in South London. What was more shocking was that, like the London Bridge attacker, he had recently been automatically released halfway through his prison sentence. In response, the government has promised emergency legislation. I'm joined now by the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Jonathan Hall. Good evening.
Good evening.
This terrorist attacker who was shot dead by the law enforcement authorities, as the law stands, could anything have been done to prevent his release?
No.
Nothing at all?
No.
Even though we knew that he was going to be a danger, or suspected, feared he was going to be a danger, which is why he was being tailed by 20 police and security officers.
The only things that you could do would be to use the powers available to probation and police on licence, which means the power to recall him if he misbehaved, equally the power to, for example, require him to wear a tag or to live in a certain area or approved premises. You know about that. There may have been opportunities, I don't know, to exploit things that he'd done in prison. There are sometimes offences being committed by people in prison which could allow the authorities to bring fresh criminal proceedings to extend the period of time that they stay in custody. As a fallback, there are civil powers available to the government called TPIMs, which can put strict controls on people. But as far as the sentence is concerned, no.
The government wants to end now automatic early release, that you get out after half your sentence has been served, if you've under a number of years. But it wants to do so even for those already sentenced on that basis.
Yes.
Even those already who are in prison now and expecting to get out, having served half their sentence. Could that fall foul of the European Court of Human Rights?
If all they are doing is giving the decision on release to the parole board, but not extending the amount of time that they actually spend in custody, arguably no, it would be lawful. The difficulty is not so much the lawfulness of it, but the practical consequences of it. Because if the government say that someone might stay in right until the end of their sentence, for example, someone's sentenced to 4 years, they're released at the end of the 4-year sentence because the parole board says they're far too dangerous for release, they will come out without any restraints at all on them. No licence conditions, no ability to recall them to prison, no controls on where they live, wearing a tag, so on and so forth. So there's a real risk with this proposed legislation, and I'm sure it was an unintended consequence of a cliff edge situation in which people who are considered to be risky are released, maybe a few months later, further down the line, but without the powerful way of controlling what they do as they go into the community.
You see, even if the government limits the end of automatic release just for future convicted terrorists, does that really change anything? If you're in the frame of mind of this terrorist in Streatham High Street, does it really matter if you're out in 18 months or 3 years? You're likely still to be in the same frame of mind.
Well, counter-terrorism police are fairly expert at using whatever tools are available to them. For example, if there is evidence that someone has committed a crime, maybe in custody before their release, maybe benefit fraud or something of that nature, of using that as a way of tactically disrupting what they do. And that's what counter-terrorism police do. But you're right, unless one was to say that people who commit any terrorist offence have to stay in prison for life, there is always the fact they are going to be at liberty and have to be managed.
People listening to this will think the law is leaving us quite defenceless against these people.
The majority of terrorist offences result in sentences of around 4 years. I mean, surprisingly, many offences are not at the sharp, what you call attack planning end. This is because, paradoxically, if the police are going to go in and disrupt people before they carry out terrible attacks, they may only get evidence of relatively minor things. For example, something that someone has downloaded on their phone. Now, unless one wants to say that all of those people are going to stay in custody for life, you're going to have to punish people for what they've actually done. And that does mean you're going to have a little bit of a revolving door of people who are known to be risky, going into custody for relatively short periods of time. But then, as I say, the police do have powers, in particular through licences, to control the risk when they come out.
One of your predecessors, Alex Carlisle, says the government should bring back control orders from the Blair years.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Possibly. The TPIM regime is pretty close now. When the control order...
It was always thought to be milder when the
it was milder.
Changed.
It was, but then they've added some additional things. For example, TPIMs can now require you to live in a certain area.
Why wasn't this man put under a TPIM then?
I don't know. I don't know.
If that's the one weapon we have, why you would think that at least that was the very least we could have done.
Well, this individual was at least subject to licence conditions, which means if you have close working between counter-terrorism probation officers who are quite specialised probation officers who look at risk, and the police and potentially the security services, it should be possible to make really smart decisions. For example, if you see that someone's risk is escalating, immediately recall them to prison, and that's something that can and is done.
The French have had an even bigger terrorist problem than we have. Since 2015, they have sought and taken several derogations from the European Court of Human Rights to be able to get tougher.
Yes.
Should we do the same?
The law is that the UK would have to say that there is an emergency threatening the life of the nation. It would have to take the view that there was no other way of dealing with the risk. I don't think we're there yet.
Some in Whitehall think that the answer, because we seem cribbed and confined by the law and by human rights, they may be the right considerations, but it does leave us with a problem. Because we see what happened in Streatham has happened before.
Yes.
And it's a different kind of jihadi we're up against now. It's not the spectacular planner, it is the grab a knife and kill who you can. Some say that the answer is to treat jihadis as if they're mentally ill and detain them until they're deemed no longer a risk. Could that work in law?
I think the difficulty is that you wouldn't bet the farm on risk assessments. Who is risky, who is going to go from flash to bang and actually grab the knife and do something is not very easy to detect. So I think it would be a problem in law in saying it's not judges who sentence you for what you've done, but it's expert risk assessors who decide when you get out. I don't think that we have a secure enough science of saying when someone is going to act to make that a sensible alternative.
We seem to be between a rock and a hard place.
I think that's right, but we've always been between a rock and a hard place. And as I say, there are a lot of laws out there which, if they're used well, and if there's enough integration between the various agencies...
Quite big ifs.
Quite big ifs.
All right.
Quite big ifs.
Jonathan Hall, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now, the Labour leadership contest continues, of course, and I've already done extended interviews with two of the candidates, Lisa Nandy and Emily Thornberry, and you can watch these interviews on iPlayer. We can now announce that I'll be interviewing the other two candidates in the race, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Keir Starmer. That's in an extended Andrew Neil show on the 4th of March from 7 till 8 p.m. here on BBC Two. Obviously, a date for your diaries. But for now, I'm going to be back here on BBC Two with Politics, live at 12:15 tomorrow, and again next Wednesday night, 7 p.m, same time, same place. Bye-bye.